What if your best defense against home invaders isn't technology, but four paws and military training? Every 26 seconds, a home invasion occurs in America. Today, meet Shadow, the German shepherd who sensed danger before anyone else and saved his family from armed intruders at their Montana ranch. This isn't just a dog story. It's a tale of extraordinary courage you won't forget. Hit subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. Team Dog or Team Cat? Let's dive in. The sleek black SUV wound its way along the dirt road, kicking up clouds of dust that glowed amber in the late afternoon Montana sun. Jackson Whitmore loosened his Italian silk tie and rolled down the window, letting the pine-scented air replace the lingering smell of Manhattan that seemed to cling to his clothes even after the 6-hour flight to Bozeman. "God, I've missed this," he murmured, his steel-gray eyes softening as Willow Creek Ranch came into view. The two-story timber frame house stood proudly against the backdrop of the Bridger Mountains, its wide wraparound porch and river rock chimney exactly as he remembered from his childhood summers. Jackson was 46, but looked younger, with salt and pepper hair cut precisely to frame his angular face. Decades of high-stakes business deals had etched permanent lines around his eyes, but out here, miles from the nearest board meeting, those lines seemed to fade. "It doesn't even look real," said Grace, his wife of 20 years, as she put away her e-reader. At 43, Grace had the kind of natural beauty that made strangers do double takes. Her dark chestnut hair fell in loose waves around her shoulders, and her hazel eyes reflected the landscape outside, like something from a Montana tourism brochure. From the back seat, their 16-year-old son Logan didn't look up from his phone. "No service." "Great." Tall and lanky with his father's sharp features and his mother's expressive eyes, Logan had the perpetual slouch of a teenager who'd grown 6 inches in the past year. "That's the point, buddy," Jackson said, catching his son's eye in the rearview mirror. 3 weeks of actual human interaction. Maybe you'll even remember what your old man looks like without having to check Instagram. "Dad, nobody uses Instagram anymore." "That's so 2020. Logan rolled his eyes but couldn't quite hide his smile. Grace turned in her seat. "Your father spent every summer here until college. This place practically raised him. And saved me," Jackson added quietly, thinking of how this land had been his sanctuary after his parents' divorce. "My grandfather left it to me for a reason. Some things are worth preserving." As they pulled up to the house, a large German shepherd bounded down the porch steps, barking enthusiastically. "Shadow," Jackson called out, and the dog immediately stood at attention, tail wagging but disciplined enough to wait for permission. "At least someone's happy to see us," Jackson laughed, stepping out of the car. "Come here, boy." Shadow approached with military precision, sitting at Jackson's feet until given the signal to greet him properly. Only then did the dog's training give way to joyful licks and playful jumps. "Man, he's huge," Logan said, finally showing interest as he got out of the car. "Must be, what, 100 pounds? 110, Jackson replied proudly. "Retired military working dog. Best investment I ever made outside of tech stocks." Mrs. Holden, the caretaker who maintained the property year-round, emerged from the house, wiping her hands on her apron. "Welcome home, Mr. Whitmore. I've stocked the fridge and turned down the beds. There's beef stew keeping warm for dinner." "You're a lifesaver, Helen," Grace said, embracing the older woman. As they unloaded their luggage, Jackson paused to survey his family's 100-acre legacy. The aspen trees shimmered silver green in the breeze, and beyond them, the mountains rose like ancient guardians. Something in his chest loosened, a knot of tension he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. "Everything okay?" Grace asked, slipping her arm through his. Jackson nodded, squeezing her hand. "For the first time in months?" "Yeah, everything's perfect." Little did he know how quickly perfect would shatter. 3 days into their stay at Willow Creek Ranch, the Whitmore family had settled into a comfortable rhythm. The afternoon sun hung high in the cloudless Montana sky, warming the cedar siding of the ranch house and casting dappled shadows through the aspens. In the spacious country kitchen, Grace hummed softly as she sliced lemons on a well-worn cutting board. She had traded her designer clothes for worn jeans and a faded chambray shirt that belonged to Jackson's mother. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and for the first time in months, she wore no makeup. The kitchen windows were thrown open, letting in the sweet scent of wildflowers and fresh-cut hay from the neighboring property. "Nothing beats homemade," she murmured to herself, squeezing the lemons into a pitcher of water. She added a handful of mint leaves from the herb garden and a touch of honey from a local apiary. As she stirred, she noticed how the sunlight caught the gold flecks in the honey, turning the liquid amber. Grace glanced at the antique wall clock, nearly 3. Jackson would be getting thirsty about now. He'd been on the porch since lunch, alternating between reading financial reports and dozing in the Adirondack chair his grandfather had built. Outside, Logan had finally disconnected from technology withdrawal and was exploring the property with newfound enthusiasm. His drone, a high-end model Jackson had given him for Christmas, buzzed overhead, its small camera capturing panoramic views of the mountains and valleys. "This is actually sick," Logan said to himself, controlling the drone with expert precision as he stood in the doorway of the century-old barn. The structure was a masterpiece of pioneer craftsmanship, with hand-hewn beams and the sweet, musty smell of hay and history. He navigated the drone toward a distant stand of pines, focusing the camera on something that had caught his eye. On the wraparound porch, Jackson had set aside his tablet and was enjoying the gentle breeze that rustled through the property. His eyes were half closed, his mind drifting between consciousness and dreams. This was what he needed: silence, space, time to remember who he was beyond boardrooms and balance sheets. "I should have done this years ago," he said aloud, stretching his long legs out in front of him. "Brought the family out here every summer." From his position, Jackson could see miles of Montana's stunning landscape. The property backed up to national forest land, creating an uninterrupted vista of wilderness. Somewhere in the distance, an eagle soared on thermal currents, its wingspan impressive even from afar. What Jackson couldn't see, however, was the dusty black pickup that had slowed to a crawl on the service road that ran behind the property. Nor could he see the 2 men inside, studying satellite images on a tablet and comparing them to the layout of Willow Creek Ranch. "That's definitely the place," the driver said, his voice low and gravelly. "Remote enough, but not so far we can't make a quick getaway." His companion nodded, zooming in on the image. "Look, security cameras on the main house, but the blind spots are exactly where our guy said they'd be." He tapped the screen. "Between the garage and the side entrance. And see that shed? Perfect cover when we approach." The truck continued past the property, making a slow loop around the perimeter before disappearing down a maintenance road that led into the forest preserve. Shadow, who had been napping under the porch steps, suddenly lifted his head. His ears swiveled forward, then back, catching something beyond human hearing range. The German shepherd rose to his feet, body instantly alert, muscles tense under his black and tan coat. Grace was just adding ice to the pitcher when Shadow appeared at the kitchen door, his posture stiff and attentive. "What is it, boy?" she asked, noticing his unusual behavior. "You need to go out?" But Shadow wasn't looking at her. His amber eyes were fixed on something beyond the window, his nose working overtime to process information only he could detect. In the barn, Logan's drone camera suddenly captured something unexpected: movement in the tree line, a flash of dark clothing against the green foliage. He zoomed in, curious. "Huh, weird," he muttered, adjusting the controls to get a better look. Didn't Dad say this was private property? The peaceful afternoon at Willow Creek Ranch continued to unfold, the family still unaware that they were being watched, assessed, and planned for. The Montana sun shone brightly on the idyllic scene, betraying nothing of the shadow about to fall across it. Shadow moved with deliberate purpose, his powerful frame tense as he crossed from the kitchen door to the living room window in 3 swift strides. The German shepherd's training was evident in every movement, economical, precise, and focused. At 110 pounds of solid muscle, Shadow was an imposing sight even when relaxed. Now, with his hackles raised and ears forward, he looked formidable. Grace watched him, the pitcher of lemonade forgotten on the counter. In the 3 years since Jackson had brought Shadow home, she'd never seen the dog behave this way without cause. "Shadow, what do you see, boy?" Grace approached slowly, placing a gentle hand on his muscular shoulder. The dog's coat was rough beneath her fingers, his body vibrating with a low growl that she felt more than heard. Outside, near the fence line that separated the manicured portion of the ranch from the wilder acreage beyond. Shadow's keen senses had detected something the humans couldn't. Unfamiliar scents carried on the Montana breeze, the subtle sound of boots on pine needles, the displacement of wildlife in patterns that didn't match natural movement. Grace moved to the window, scanning the property. Nothing seemed amiss. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the lawn, and the wind gently rustled the aspen leaves. Yet Shadow's behavior told a different story. "Jackson," she called through the screen door. Something's wrong with Shadow. On the porch, Jackson sat up straight, instantly alert. 20 years in cutthroat business had taught him to trust warning signs. He stood, shading his eyes against the sun. "What's he doing?" Jackson asked, moving quickly to join them in the living room. "I don't know," Grace replied, her voice tight with concern. "But you know he doesn't get worked up over nothing." Shadow moved to the door, his growl deepening. The sound rumbled from his chest, not aggressive, but alerting, communicating danger to his family. Jackson knelt beside the dog, one hand on his collar. "What is it, buddy? What do you hear?" As if in response, Shadow gave 3 sharp barks, the exact signal he'd been trained to give when detecting an intruder. "Christ," Jackson muttered, immediately moving to the gun safe concealed behind a landscape painting. "Grace, get Logan in the house. Now." Grace hesitated only a moment before rushing toward the barn, her heart pounding. Shadow watched her go, then turned his attention back to the threat, his dark eyes fixed on the tree line where the property met the forest. Logan was still in the barn doorway, engrossed in the drone's feed. The camera had lost sight of whatever movement he'd spotted earlier, but he continued to scan the area methodically. "Logan," Grace called, startling him. "Inside now? Your father wants everyone in the house." "Mom, I think I saw someone in the woods," Logan said, quickly bringing the drone back toward the barn. "Like, someone dressed in black, moving between the trees." Grace felt her stomach tighten. "Get inside. Bring your drone." As they hurried across the yard, Shadow appeared at the side gate, having circled around the house. The dog moved with military precision, sweeping the perimeter in expanding circles, exactly as he'd been trained to do. Jackson met them at the door, a loaded shotgun in his hands. "Stay inside," he instructed, his voice calm, but leaving no room for argument. "I'm going to check it out." "Jackson, don't," Grace pleaded, grabbing his arm. "If there really is someone out there, then I need to know who and why," he finished. "The sheriff's station is 40 minutes away. We need to know what we're dealing with." Logan's eyes widened at the sight of the gun. "Dad, I saw something on the drone feed, near the old pine stand, by the creek." Jackson nodded, his expression grim. "Show me the footage later. For now, stay with your mother. Lock the doors behind me." Outside, Shadow had taken up position near the fence line, his body low to the ground, almost invisible in the tall grass. His training as a military working dog was evident in his tactical positioning. He'd placed himself between the perceived threat and his family. The wind shifted slightly, bringing new information to Shadow's sensitive nose. He detected gun oil, unfamiliar cologne, cigarette smoke, and the distinct scent of fear, human fear, which told him these were not casual hikers who had wandered onto the property by mistake. Shadow's ears flattened against his head as he issued a warning growl that carried across the open space. In the distance, birds suddenly took flight from a cluster of trees, confirming the dog's assessment. Someone was there, moving through the property, disturbing the natural patterns of the wilderness. Inside the house, Grace checked that all doors were locked while Logan pulled up the security camera feed on his laptop. "The cameras don't cover the whole property," he said, frustration clear in his voice. "There's a blind spot by the old shed and another near the side gate." Grace nodded, her hand on her cell phone. "I'm calling the sheriff. Even if it takes them a while to get here, they should know." Through the window, they watched as Jackson moved cautiously across the yard, shotgun ready, following Shadow's lead. The dog had transformed from family pet to guardian, every muscle in his powerful body prepared to defend his territory and his people. The peaceful Montana afternoon had shattered, replaced by a tense silence broken only by Shadow's continuous low growling, a sound that sent shivers down Grace's spine. Whatever was coming, Shadow had sensed it first, and his instincts were rarely wrong. The pine trees at the edge of Willow Creek Ranch stood sentinel, their shadows lengthening as the afternoon sun began its slow descent toward the mountains. Within this natural cover, two figures moved with practiced stealth, their dark clothing blending with the dappled shade. Marcus Reeves adjusted the black ski mask over his face, his eyes, cold and calculating, visible through the cutouts. At 42, he had the lean, wiry build of someone who kept himself in shape for exactly this kind of work. 3 years in state prison had taught him patience and precision. Beside him, his partner Dennis Walsh checked the tablet one more time, studying the property layout. "Remember, we stick to the plan," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible over the gentle rustle of pine needles beneath their boots. "In and out in 20 minutes. The safe's in the master bedroom, northwest corner. The documents are in the home office." Dennis nodded, tucking the tablet into his jacket pocket. Younger than Marcus by a decade, he was nervous, his fingers drumming against the taser at his hip. "What about the dog?" "The intel said they have a German shepherd. That's why we brought these," Marcus replied, patting the pocket that contained several pieces of drugged meat. "Military dogs are disciplined. They don't take food from strangers unless commanded. But this one's been a civilian long enough to have picked up bad habits." The men moved silently through the underbrush, careful to stay within the blind spots they'd identified in the ranch's security system. Years of planning similar jobs had taught Marcus how to disappear in plain sight. He'd spent weeks studying the property, learning its rhythms and vulnerabilities. "There's the side gate," Dennis whispered, pointing to a wooden gate partially hidden by a flowering bush. "Camera above the main entrance doesn't cover it." Marcus checked his watch, 3:47 p.m. Perfect timing. According to our intel, the caretaker's gone for the day, and the family should be scattered around the property. The husband's usually napping on the porch this time of day. They approached the gate with caution, keeping low. From their position, they could see part of the main house, the wraparound porch, the kitchen windows thrown open to catch the summer breeze. A pitcher of what looked like lemonade sat on the counter inside, condensation forming on its glass surface. "I still don't get why this place is so important," Dennis muttered as they reached the gate. "It's nice, but not exactly Fort Knox." Marcus shot him a warning glance. "We're not paid to ask questions. The client wants specific documents from Whitmore's office and anything else we can grab quickly. That's all we need to know." As Dennis worked on the gate latch, Marcus surveyed the property with experienced eyes. Something felt off. The house seemed too quiet, and he couldn't see any movement on the porch where the husband should be. "Hold up," he whispered, placing a restraining hand on Dennis's arm. "Something's wrong." At that moment, a distant bark echoed across the property, sharp, alert, and purposeful. "Shit," Dennis hissed. "The dog spotted us." "Impossible. We're downwind," Marcus replied, though uncertainty crept into his voice. "Military dogs are different. They don't just react to scent." They watched as a large German shepherd appeared from around the side of the house, its posture alert, head high as it scanned the property perimeter. "That's not just any dog," Marcus whispered, a new respect in his voice. "That's a Belgian Malinois German shepherd mix. Look at how it moves. That's a trained protection dog, probably ex-military or police." The dog began a methodical patrol of the property, moving with purpose rather than the random patterns of a pet. Its training was evident in every calculated step. "We need to adjust the plan," Marcus decided quickly. "I'll handle the security system by the garage. You circle around to the back entrance. We'll need to be faster now." Dennis nodded, nervousness evident in his jerky movements. "What about the dog?" "Avoid it if possible. If not," Marcus pulled out a small tranquilizer gun from his backpack. "Last resort only. A dead dog brings heat we don't need." They separated at the gate, each taking their designated route. Marcus moved silently along the edge of the property, using shrubs and garden structures for cover. He reached the garage without incident, quickly locating the external alarm junction box. With practiced hands, he removed a small electronic device from his pocket, a signal jammer designed to interrupt the wireless security system. As he attached it to the box, he heard footsteps on gravel. Freezing in place, he saw the tall figure of Jackson Whitmore emerge from the house, shotgun in hand. "Damn it," Marcus breathed, pressing himself against the garage wall. This wasn't in the plan. The family was supposed to be relaxed, off guard, not armed and alert. Across the yard, Dennis had reached the back of the property and was approaching the kitchen door, unaware of Jackson's presence. From his position, Marcus could see the German Shepherd changing course, its body low to the ground, heading directly toward where Dennis was about to emerge from cover. The infiltration that had been meticulously planned for weeks was rapidly unraveling. As Marcus weighed his options, he realized the simple smash-and-grab job had just become infinitely more complicated. Whatever Whitmore had in that house, he was clearly prepared to defend it, and so was his extraordinary dog. The late afternoon sun cast Marcus's shadow long against the side of the garage as he huddled against the wall, the security junction box open before him. His gloved fingers worked methodically despite the surge of adrenaline in his system. 20 years of breaking into supposedly secure properties had taught him to compartmentalize fear. "Come on, you piece of garbage," he whispered to the alarm system, carefully cross-connecting wires in a sequence designed to disable without triggering. The system was more sophisticated than their intelligence had suggested. Not standard home security, but a custom setup with military-grade components. As Marcus worked, Jackson Whitmore moved cautiously across the yard, shotgun held at the ready. From his position, Marcus could see the businessman's face, focused, determined, and completely unafraid. This wasn't the soft corporate executive he'd expected. "Shadow, find," Jackson commanded, his voice low but carrying across the property. The German Shepherd responded immediately, putting his nose to the ground and moving in a widening spiral pattern. Marcus froze, holding his breath. He'd dealt with guard dogs before, but something about this one was different. The methodical search, the perfect discipline, the absolute focus. This wasn't just a pet. This was a weapon with 4 legs. Meanwhile, Dennis had reached the back porch and was consulting the stolen floor plans one last time. The blueprints they'd acquired showed a detailed layout of the main house. Every room, every window, every potential entry point. Dennis traced his finger along the path to Jackson's home office, where their client had insisted certain documents would be found. "The floor plans show a security system circa 2018, Dennis muttered to himself. "Should be a cakewalk." What the plans didn't show were the upgrades Jackson had installed just 6 months earlier. Motion sensors in every room, pressure plates under certain floorboards, and a silent alarm connected directly to the sheriff's department. These additions weren't in any public records, a precaution Jackson had taken after receiving threats related to his latest business venture. Inside the house, Grace had positioned herself at the top of the stairs, a revolver, a gift from her father years ago, held steadily in both hands. Unlike her husband, she'd grown up in Montana, and shooting had been part of her upbringing. "Logan," she called softly to her son, who was in his room. "Stay down and stay quiet." "Mom," Logan's voice cracked slightly. "I can see someone by the back door on my drone feed." Grace's heart pounded, but her hands remained steady. "Can you get a clear image?" "Working on it," Logan replied, fingers flying over his controller. Bringing the drone lower now. Outside, Jackson had spotted something, a flash of movement near the tool shed. He signaled to Shadow, who immediately changed direction, moving silently toward the outbuilding. Marcus, having finally bypassed the main alarm, was now making his way toward the side entrance. The floor plans had indicated that this door was rarely used and connected to a mudroom, perfect for a quiet entry. What he didn't know was that Jackson had installed a separate system just for this entrance after finding evidence that someone had attempted to jimmy the lock during their absence last winter. Dennis reached the kitchen door and began working on the lock. Modern pin tumbler locks were child's play for him, and within seconds, he heard the satisfying click of the mechanism giving way. "I'm in," he whispered into the small radio clipped to his collar. Proceeding to the office, Marcus acknowledged with a short click, continuing his approach to the side entrance. The timing was critical now. They needed to be in and out before any neighbors could respond to a potential alarm or before the family could organize a defense. What neither man realized was that Jackson Whitmore had already activated the ranch's emergency protocol. A small red button, concealed behind a decorative plate in the living room, had sent a silent alert to the 5 nearest ranches, all owned by close friends who had made a pact years ago to respond to each other's emergencies given their remote locations. Inside the house, Dennis slipped through the kitchen door, carefully stepping over the threshold. The room was warm and smelled of lemons and mint. The abandoned pitcher of lemonade sat on the counter. ice still slowly melting in the amber liquid. He consulted the floor plan again, straight through the dining room, down the hall, third door on the right. As he moved, Dennis was unaware of the pressure plate hidden beneath the antique Persian rug, a silent trigger that illuminated a small light on the security panel in the master bedroom. Grace saw the indicator flash and tightened her grip on the revolver. Outside, Shadow had reached the tool shed and was circling it, nose to the ground, following an invisible trail. Jackson stood 15 feet back, shotgun ready, giving the dog room to work. Shadow stopped suddenly, head up, ears forward, every muscle in his powerful body tensed for action. "What is it, boy?" Jackson whispered. "Show me." Shadow's training kicked in. Rather than barking and potentially alerting the intruder, he used a different signal, sitting perfectly still and facing the exact direction of the threat, a behavior that told Jackson someone was hiding on the other side of the shed. Marcus, still unaware that his partner had already entered the house, reached the side door. The lock was simple enough, but something made him hesitate. Years of experience had given him an almost supernatural sense for traps, and every instinct was now screaming at him that something wasn't right. He pressed his ear to the door, listening. The house seemed quiet, too quiet for a family of 3 plus a dog. It felt like the calm before a storm, that peculiar stillness that descends when every living thing senses impending danger. As Marcus debated his next move, he didn't notice the dust cloud rising in the distance as 3 pickup trucks barreled down the service road toward Willow Creek Ranch, the neighboring ranchers responding to Jackson's silent alarm. Each truck carrying men who considered the defense of their community a sacred duty. The threat was unfolding from all sides now, the carefully planned infiltration rapidly deteriorating into something far more dangerous for everyone involved. Shadow remained perfectly still, his amber eyes locked on the tool shed, every muscle in his powerful body coiled and ready to launch. The German Shepherd's training had overridden his natural instinct to bark and charge. Instead, he waited for the command, his focus unwavering despite the wind carrying a symphony of distracting scents across the property. Jackson approached cautiously, keeping the shotgun trained on the shed. Years of handling difficult business negotiations had taught him to maintain composure under pressure, but this was different. This was his family, his home. "Shadow guard," he whispered. The command released the dog from his stationary position. Shadow began a silent circle of the shed, closing the distance with each pass, giving whoever was hiding no chance to escape unnoticed. Inside the house, Dennis moved with practiced stealth through the dining room, his boots making no sound on the hardwood floor. The stolen floor plans were proving accurate, so far, at least. He passed a family portrait on the wall, Jackson, Grace, and Logan standing on this very porch, Shadow sitting dutifully at their feet. Rich people and their perfect lives, Dennis muttered under his breath. He reached the hallway that led to Jackson's home office. According to their client, the documents inside were worth far more than any jewelry or cash in the house. Detailed surveys showing the underground aquifer that ran beneath Willow Creek Ranch, along with mineral rights papers that Jackson had refused to sell despite numerous generous offers. As Dennis reached for the office door handle, he heard a faint noise from upstairs, the subtle creak of a floorboard. He froze, listening intently. Another creak followed, then silence. "Someone's up there," he whispered into his radio. "I thought everyone was supposed to be outside." No response came from Marcus, who was currently frozen beside the tool shed, acutely aware of the German Shepherd systematically eliminating his hiding options. Dennis hesitated only briefly before continuing toward the office. The job came first, get the documents, then worry about the rest. He turned the office door handle and slipped inside, closing the door softly behind him. The office was immaculate, leather-bound books lined built-in shelves. A large oak desk commanded the center of the room, and through the window, the Montana mountains provided a stunning backdrop. Dennis moved quickly to the desk, pulling out a small flashlight to examine the drawers. Outside, Shadow had completed his third circle of the shed, each pass bringing him closer to his target. On the fourth pass, he caught the scent he'd been tracking: human, male, nervous, and carrying the distinct smell of gun oil and city streets that didn't belong in the clean Montana air. Marcus pressed himself against the shed wall, the tranquilizer gun now in his hand. He'd lost communication with Dennis and had no idea what was happening inside the house. The job was rapidly deteriorating, but their client had been very clear: return with the documents or don't return at all. Shadow rounded the corner of the shed and stopped, his eyes locking with Marcus's. For a heartbeat, neither moved, predator recognizing predator across years of evolutionary divide. "Nice doggy," Marcus whispered, slowly raising the tranquilizer gun. Shadow didn't growl, didn't bark a warning. His military training had taught him that noise telegraphed intent. Instead, he launched himself forward in a blur of black and tan fur, covering the 10 feet between them in a fraction of a second. Marcus fired the tranquilizer, but his hand shook at the crucial moment. The dart grazed Shadow's shoulder, delivering only a partial dose of the sedative, enough to slow an ordinary dog, but not nearly enough to stop a highly trained former military working dog running on adrenaline and protective instinct. Shadow's 110 pounds hit Marcus with the force of a linebacker, knocking him flat against the ground. Trained to disable rather than kill, Shadow locked his powerful jaws around Marcus's wrist, the one holding the tranquilizer gun, applying precisely enough pressure to cause searing pain without crushing the bones. Marcus screamed, the sound echoing across the property. Jackson rushed forward, shotgun trained on the intruder. "Don't move," he commanded. Shadow hold. The dog maintained his grip, growling low in his throat, his eyes never leaving Marcus's face. Despite the partial sedative now coursing through his system, Shadow's training kept him focused on his task, immobilized the threat. Inside the house, Dennis heard the scream. "Marcus!" He hissed into his radio, receiving only static in response. His hands faltered as he searched through the desk drawers, finding nothing resembling the documents they'd been sent to retrieve. The sound of a gun being cocked behind him froze Dennis in place. "Looking for something?" Grace's voice was steady, the revolver in her hands unwavering as she stood in the office doorway. Dennis slowly raised his hands. "This isn't what it looks like, lady." "Really?" Grace's eyebrow arched. "Because it looks like you broke into our home and are going through my husband's private papers." Outside, Jackson had secured Marcus, using zip ties from his pocket to bind the intruder's hands behind his back. Shadow maintained his vigilant stance, though Jackson could see the dog was fighting the effects of whatever drug had been in the dart. "Who sent you?" Jackson demanded, his voice hard as Montana granite. Marcus spat on the ground. "Lawyer. I want a lawyer." The sound of vehicles approaching caught Jackson's attention. 3 pickup trucks roared up the drive, followed by a cloud of dust. Men with rifles piled out, the neighboring ranchers responding to the silent alarm. Among them was Sheriff Mike Delaney, who happened to be having coffee at the Wilson Ranch when the alert came through. "Jackson," the sheriff called, jogging toward them. "Got your alarm. What's the situation?" "One intruder secured," Jackson replied, nodding toward Marcus. Shadow caught him. "There may be another inside. Grace and Logan are in there." As if on cue, the back door opened, and Grace emerged, marching Dennis forward at gunpoint. "Found this one in your office," she called to Jackson, her voice remarkably calm for someone who'd just apprehended an armed intruder. Sheriff Delaney whistled appreciatively. "Damn, Grace. Remind me never to break into your house." Logan appeared in the doorway, his drone controller still in his hands. "Mom was amazing," he said, his voice cracking with excitement and residual fear. "She just stood there like some kind of action movie star and said, 'Make one move and they'll be cleaning you off my carpet for a week.'" Grace blushed slightly. "I might have been a bit theatrical." Shadow, having been released from his hold command, moved to Logan's side, leaning against the boy's leg in a protective gesture. Despite the partial sedative, the dog remained alert, his eyes constantly scanning for additional threats. As Sheriff Delaney read the intruders their rights and loaded them into his truck, Jackson pulled Grace and Logan into a tight embrace. "Are you both okay?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. Grace nodded against his chest. "Thanks to Shadow. He knew something was wrong before any of us." They all looked down at the German Shepherd, who sat at attention despite the tranquilizer now visibly affecting him, his eyes beginning to droop though he fought to keep them open. "He needs a vet," Jackson said, kneeling to examine the graze on Shadow's shoulder. "Right now." As one of the neighboring ranchers, a former combat medic, approached to help with Shadow, the German Shepherd's eyes remained fixed on his family, his duty to protect them overriding the chemical trying to pull him into unconsciousness. In the space of 15 minutes, Shadow had transformed from family pet to hero, proving that the bond between a dog and his family transcended training, instinct, and even chemistry. It was something deeper, something that no intruder could ever understand or overcome. The Montana twilight was beginning to settle over Willow Creek Ranch, painting the sky in vivid strokes of orange and purple as Sheriff Delaney secured Dennis in the back of his patrol vehicle beside an already restrained Marcus. The property buzzed with activity, neighboring ranchers forming a perimeter, emergency lights flashing, and voices carrying across the yard as statements were taken and evidence collected. In the midst of this controlled chaos, Grace sat on the porch steps, one hand gently stroking Shadow's head, while Dr. Ellie Rodriguez, the local veterinarian who had responded to Jackson's urgent call, examined the sedative wound on the German Shepherd's shoulder. "He's going to be just fine," Dr. Rodriguez assured, her experienced hands moving confidently over Shadow's powerful frame. The dart only delivered a partial dose of what looks like ketamine, enough to make him drowsy but not enough to take him down. His size and adrenaline worked in his favor. Grace nodded gratefully, her fingers tracing the outline of Shadow's ear. "He saved us. Without him." She couldn't finish the sentence, the implications too disturbing to voice. Inside the house, Jackson stood in his office with Sheriff Delaney, surveying the disarray left by Dennis's hasty search. Desk drawers hung open, papers scattered across the hardwood floor, and a painting had been removed from the wall, revealing the small safe behind it. They knew exactly what they were looking for, Jackson said, carefully straightening a framed photo of his grandfather that had been knocked over in the chaos. This wasn't some random break-in. Sheriff Delaney nodded, his weathered face grave beneath his department-issue Stetson. "Your alarm system saved your bacon, Jackson. Without the community alert, this could have gone south real quick." Jackson's mind flashed to the red emergency button he'd installed 3 years ago after a series of break-ins at remote properties across the county. The system was simple but effective, a silent alarm that simultaneously alerted the sheriff's department and 5 neighboring ranches, creating a rapid response network that compensated for the limitations of rural law enforcement. "They found the panic button in the kitchen," Grace said, appearing in the doorway with Logan beside her. Shadow followed at their heels, moving more slowly than usual, but still watchful. "I hit it as soon as Shadow started acting strange. Didn't even think about it, just reacted." Logan, who had been uncharacteristically quiet since the intruders had been taken away, finally spoke up. "I got all of it on the drone," he said, holding up his controller. "The whole thing. That guy by the shed, Shadow taking him down, everything." Sheriff Delaney's eyebrows shot up. "Son, that's evidence. We're gonna need that footage." Jackson placed a hand on Logan's shoulder, feeling a surge of pride at his son's quick thinking. "Good work, Logan. Really good work." Outside, one of the neighboring ranchers, Bill Henson from the adjacent property, approached the house with something clutched in his hand. "Found this about half a mile down the service road," he said, holding up a small 2-way radio. "Must have fallen off one of them when they were setting up." Sheriff Delaney took the radio, examining it carefully. High-end equipment. These boys came prepared. He pressed the transmit button experimentally. "Hello? Anyone listening?" To everyone's surprise, a voice immediately crackled back through the speaker. "Marcus? Dennis? What's your status? Over." The sheriff's eyes widened as he quickly switched off the radio. "Well, I'll be damned. Looks like there's a third man out there. A getaway driver," Jackson concluded, his jaw tightening. "Eagle Ridge Road," Bill said immediately. "That's where I found the radio. There's a turnout there with a view of the whole valley. Perfect spot to monitor the operation and make a quick exit." Sheriff Delaney was already moving toward his vehicle, radio in hand. "I'm calling for backup, but it'll take at least 40 minutes for additional units to get here from Bozeman." Grace stepped forward, her face set with determination. "We're not waiting 40 minutes with some unknown person out there possibly watching us." She turned to the assembled ranchers. "Bill, take the North Ridge Trail. Tom and Randall, circle around through the aspen grove. If he's up there, we'll box him in." The men nodded, immediately heading for their trucks. This was Montana ranching country, where neighbors still looked out for each other, and threats to one family were considered threats to all. "Grace," Jackson began, concern evident in his voice. "I grew up in these mountains, Jackson," she said firmly. "I know every trail and hiding spot. These men came here with a purpose, and I'm not resting until we know exactly what it was and who sent them." Inside the patrol car, Marcus and Dennis sat in sullen silence, watching the activity through the windows. Dennis leaned closer to his partner, keeping his voice low. "Carter's still out there. He'll get us out." Marcus shook his head slightly. "They found the radio. Carter's smart enough to bail." He glanced at his watch, wincing as the movement sent pain shooting through the wrist that Shadow had clamped down on. If he follows protocol, he's already halfway to Bozeman. Meanwhile, on Eagle Ridge Road, a man in dark clothing observed the ranch through high-powered binoculars. Carter Reed, the third member of their team, had watched the entire operation fall apart in less than 20 minutes. He'd seen the dog take down Marcus, watched as Dennis was marched out of the house at gunpoint, and observed the arrival of the sheriff and neighboring ranchers. "Amateurs," he muttered, lowering the binoculars and returning to the black SUV parked behind a stand of pines. Carter was no amateur. He'd served 10 years in special forces before turning his skills to more lucrative private ventures. He knew when a job was blown, and this one had been blown spectacularly. He started the engine, his hand hovering over the gear shift. Protocol dictated that he leave now, abandon Marcus and Dennis to their fate, and rendezvous with their client at the secondary location. That was the professional move. But something made him hesitate. The documents they'd been sent to retrieve were worth millions, possibly billions, to the right people. Their client had been abundantly clear. Failure was not an option. Carter put the SUV in gear, but instead of heading toward the highway, he turned onto a narrow forest trail that ran parallel to the main road. There was another way onto the Whitmore property, a maintenance road that bordered the national forest. If he could reach the house from the rear, while everyone was focused on the front. Back at the ranch, Logan had uploaded the drone footage to his laptop and was reviewing it with Sheriff Delaney and Jackson. The high-definition video clearly showed Marcus's face before he'd pulled on the ski mask, captured the moment Shadow had taken him down, and even recorded snippets of conversation. "Right there," Logan said, freezing the frame and pointing to the screen. He said something about documents. "Listen." He turned up the volume, and Marcus's voice became audible through the drone's microphone. "Get the surveys and water rights, or we don't get paid." Jackson's face darkened. "The water surveys. That's what this is about." Grace stepped closer, peering at the screen. "The aquifer documentation? Why would anyone break in for that?" "Because," Jackson said grimly, "according to those surveys, Willow Creek Ranch sits on top of one of the largest untapped freshwater reserves in the Northern Rockies. My grandfather discovered it back in the 60s, but kept it quiet. He didn't want developers turning this place into the next Aspen." Sheriff Delaney whistled low. "In today's market, with water rights becoming more valuable than oil rights in some places, that's one hell of a motive." Shadow, who had been resting at Logan's feet, suddenly lifted his head, ears perked forward. A low growl rumbled from his chest. "He still hears something," Logan said, looking down at the dog with concern. Grace moved to the window, scanning the darkening landscape. "The others haven't radioed in yet. They must still be searching for the third man." Outside, the emergency lights from Sheriff Delaney's vehicle cast pulsing red and blue patterns across the yard, creating surreal shadows that danced across the property. In the midst of this kaleidoscopic illumination, Shadow rose to his feet, his posture once again alert despite the sedative still in his system. The emergency protocol had worked. The intruders had been caught, help had arrived, and the family was safe. But as the Montana night descended on Willow Creek Ranch, the tension in the air suggested that their ordeal wasn't over just yet. Somewhere in the gathering darkness, the third man was making his move, and only Shadow seemed aware of the approaching danger. The Montana night settled over Willow Creek Ranch like a heavy blanket, stars emerging as brilliant pinpricks against the darkening sky. With the immediate threat contained in Sheriff Delaney's patrol vehicle, a different kind of activity now animated the property. The Rancher Response Network in full operation, a system of mutual aid as old as the frontier itself, but updated for modern threats. 5 pickup trucks formed a protective perimeter around the main house, their headlights illuminating the surrounding terrain in overlapping cones of light. Local men and women, ranchers, farmers, and their families, moved with purpose, carrying rifles and communicating via handheld radios. This wasn't their first rodeo. The community had drilled for situations like this, recognizing that in remote Montana, neighbors were often the only immediate help available. Bill Henson, whose property bordered the eastern edge of Willow Creek Ranch, approached the porch where Jackson stood watching the coordinated effort. At 62, Bill's weathered face told the story of a lifetime under the Montana sun, but his movements remained quick and decisive. "We've got teams covering all access roads," Bill reported, adjusting the worn Stetson on his gray hair. "Tom and his boys are patrolling the ridgeline, and Sarah's got her horses watching the creek crossing. Nobody's getting in or out without us knowing." Jackson nodded gratefully, still processing the events of the past hour. "I can't thank you all enough, Bill." The way everyone responded. Bill waved away the thanks with a calloused hand. "Hell, Jackson, we've been running the emergency protocols for years. Your family's part of this community, whether you spend 2 weeks or 2 months here each year. Besides," he added with a wry smile, "Grace is Montana born and bred. We take care of our own." Inside the house, Grace was helping Dr. Rodriguez administer a counteragent to the sedative in Shadow's system. The German Shepherd lay stoically on a blanket in the living room, allowing the vet to insert an 4-line into his foreleg. "This will flush the ketamine faster," Dr. Rodriguez explained, her voice soft and reassuring. "He's fighting it well, but I'd rather not leave anything to chance." Military dogs like Shadow are trained to work through pain and impairment, which is impressive but can mask serious issues. Grace stroked Shadow's head, feeling the coarse fur beneath her fingers. "He sensed they were coming before any of us had a clue." "How did he know?" Dr. Rodriguez smiled as she adjusted the foredrip. "German Shepherds have around 225 million olfactory receptors compared to our measly 5 million. Add his military training, and Shadow probably smelled these guys from half a mile away. Their unfamiliar scent, their adrenaline, maybe even the intent rolling off them." In the kitchen, Logan sat at the table with Sheriff Delaney, going through the drone footage frame by frame. The teenager had surprised everyone with his composure during the crisis, channeling his fear into focused action. "There," Logan said, pointing to a shadowy figure visible for just a moment at the edge of the frame. "I think that's the third guy. The quality's not great because of the tree coverage, but you can see he's watching the house from that ridgeline." Sheriff Delaney leaned closer, squinting at the screen. "Good eye, son. That's definitely someone. And he's not dressed for hiking." He keyed his radio. "Tom, this is Delaney. Check the west ridge again, about 200 yards from the lightning-struck pine. We've got possible visual on our third suspect." The radio crackled with Tom's response. "Copy that, Sheriff. Moving to position now." Jackson entered the kitchen, his cell phone in hand. "Just got off the phone with my security team in New York. They've identified our visitors." He laid 3 printouts on the table. Police mugshots showing Marcus, Dennis, and a third man none of them had seen before. Marcus Reeves, Dennis Walsh, and Carter Reed. All former military, all with records for high-end burglary and corporate espionage. Corporate espionage. Sheriff Delaney's eyebrows rose. "This keeps getting more interesting." Jackson nodded grimly. "They typically work for hedge funds and developers, stealing proprietary information. The question is, who hired them to come after the water rights documentation?" Outside, the coordinated search continued. The Rancher Response Network had evolved over years of necessity. Wildfires, lost hikers, escaped livestock, and increasingly, criminal activity targeting remote properties. Through trial and error, they had developed protocols that leveraged their intimate knowledge of the land and their self-reliance. Bill Henson's daughter, Maddie, a 25-year-old who'd returned to the family ranch after college, approached the house on horseback. She dismounted in one fluid motion, tying her paint horse to the porch railing. "Dad," she called, "we found something." Bill and Jackson stepped outside to meet her. Maddie held up a black tactical backpack. This was stashed under some brush near the old logging road. "Looks like someone's emergency kit." Jackson took the backpack, carefully unzipping it. Inside were spare magazines, night vision goggles, energy bars, a first aid kit, and a satellite phone. "Well prepared," Jackson murmured, examining the equipment. "This is an amateur hour." Sheriff Delaney joined them on the porch, examining the satellite phone with interest. "This might give us a direct line to whoever's behind this." He bagged it carefully as evidence. State Crime Lab can pull data from it. Maybe get us some numbers. Suddenly, the radio at Bill's hip crackled to life with Tom's urgent voice. Movement at the West Creek crossing. I've got visual on a male subject, dark clothing, moving fast toward the county road. He's in a black SUV now, heading south. Sheriff Delaney was already running toward his patrol car. That's our third man. I need 2 trucks to back me up. We'll set up a roadblock at the junction with Highway 89. Without hesitation, 2 of the neighboring ranchers jumped into their pickups, engines roaring to life as they followed the sheriff down the gravel drive. The remaining ranchers tightened their perimeter around the house, everyone moving with heightened vigilance. Inside, Shadow suddenly stood up, pulling the 4-line taut. Dr. Rodriguez moved to settle him, but the dog's attention was fixed on the front door, his posture alert despite the medication. "What is it, boy?" Grace asked, recognizing the now familiar signs of Shadow's warning behavior. Before anyone could react, Shadow barked sharply, 3 short, commanding sounds that echoed through the house. Through the window, Grace saw the reason for his alarm: a set of headlights turning onto the property from an access road that wasn't the main drive. "Someone's coming," she called out, her hand moving instinctively to the revolver she'd set aside on the coffee table. Bill Henson was already on the porch, rifle raised, as the vehicle approached. He relaxed visibly when the distinctive light bar of a Montana Highway Patrol vehicle became visible. "It's the state, boys," he announced. Sheriff's backup finally arrived. As 2 uniformed troopers emerged from the vehicle, the atmosphere at Willow Creek Ranch shifted subtly. The immediate danger had passed, but the Rancher Response Network remained vigilant. This was their way. They didn't stand down until every member of their community was secure. Inside, Jackson knelt beside Shadow, who had settled back onto his blanket but remained watchful, his intelligent eyes moving between the family members as if conducting a perpetual head count. "Good boy," Jackson whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "The best boy." The German shepherd responded with a gentle thump of his tail against the hardwood floor, a sound that seemed to say that all was well, for now. The Rancher Response Network had mobilized with impressive speed and efficiency, transforming a wealthy businessman's vacation home into a fortress within minutes of Grace pressing the panic button. As Sheriff Delaney's voice came over the radio announcing they had successfully detained Carter Reed at the roadblock, a collective sigh of relief passed through everyone at Willow Creek Ranch. The emergency protocol, a blend of modern technology and frontier solidarity, had worked exactly as designed. Grace settled on the floor beside Shadow, one arm draped protectively over the dog's massive shoulders. "You know," she said to no one in particular, "I've never felt safer than right now, surrounded by neighbors with guns and a half-sedated military dog." And somehow, in the context of rural Montana, this made perfect sense to everyone in the room. The first hint of dawn colored the eastern sky as Sheriff Mike Delaney returned to Willow Creek Ranch, his cruiser kicking up dust along the gravel drive. The night had been long, statements taken, evidence collected, and prisoners processed at the small county jail in Bozeman. Most of the neighboring ranchers had returned to their properties, though Bill Henson and his daughter Maddie remained, keeping watch from the porch with thermos cups of coffee steaming in the cool morning air. Inside the ranch house, Jackson sat at the kitchen table, fatigue etched in the lines around his eyes. Grace moved quietly around the kitchen, preparing breakfast for those who had stayed through the night. The rhythmic sound of her knife against the cutting board, chopping peppers and onions for omelets, provided a comforting counterpoint to the tension still lingering in the air. Logan had finally fallen asleep on the couch, his laptop still open beside him. The drone footage paused on the frame, showing Carter Reed's face. Shadow lay at the boy's feet, his vigilance undiminished despite the eventful night. The 4 had been removed hours ago, and while the sedative had mostly worked its way out of his system, Dr. Rodriguez had left instructions to monitor him closely for the next 24 hours. The sound of the sheriff's boots on the porch steps brought Shadow to attention, his ears forward but his position unchanged. Protecting Logan remained his priority. Grace wiped her hands on a dish towel and moved to open the door. "Sheriff," she greeted him, stepping aside to let him enter. "Coffee's fresh." Delaney removed his hat, nodding gratefully. "Wouldn't say no to that, Grace. Been a hell of a night." Jackson rose to meet him, exhaustion temporarily replaced by keen interest. Did Reed talk? The sheriff accepted the mug Grace offered, taking a long sip before answering. Oh, he talked all right. Sang like a canary once we showed him the evidence you folks collected. Having that drone footage was the clincher. Proved premeditation and conspiracy. Shadow had risen and padded silently into the kitchen, positioning himself between Logan on the couch and the adults at the table. Still on duty, still vigilant. So who hired them? Jackson asked, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. Sheriff Delaney set his coffee mug down and reached into his breast pocket, extracting a folded piece of paper. Name mean anything to you? He asked, pushing the paper across the table. Jackson unfolded it, his expression darkening as he read the name written there. Victor Crane, he said, the words like ice. Watershed Holdings. Grace's hand flew to her mouth. The development company? The one that's been buying up ranches all along the Gallatin Valley? The very same, Delaney confirmed, his weathered face grim. According to Reed, Crane hired them 3 months ago to acquire specific documents from your office, geological surveys, water rights certificates, and something called aquifer mapping data. Jackson leaned back in his chair, pinching the bridge of his nose. I should have seen this coming. Crane's been trying to get his hands on this property for years. Started with friendly offers, then less friendly suggestions. When I made it clear the ranch wasn't for sale at any price, the pressure tactics began. Fabricated property line disputes, complaints filed with the county about our septic system, that sort of thing. What's so special about this land? Delaney asked, though the knowing look in his eyes suggested he already had his suspicions. Jackson hesitated, glancing at Grace, who nodded encouragingly. Family secrets were one thing, but this had gone beyond privacy. People had been endangered. My grandfather discovered an aquifer beneath this property back in the 60s, Jackson explained, his voice low despite the fact that only trusted friends remained in the house. Not just any water source. Preliminary surveys suggested it might be one of the largest untapped freshwater reservoirs in the northern Rockies. Bill Henson, who had entered quietly during the conversation, let out a low whistle. With water rights becoming what they are in the West these days. Exactly, Jackson nodded. My grandfather kept it quiet. He was an environmentalist before that was even a term. He believed the water belonged to the land and should remain untouched unless absolutely necessary. When he left me the property, he made me promise to protect it. Sheriff Delaney reached for his coffee again. And now Crane wants to bottle it, pipe it, or otherwise monetize it. Reed was quite forthcoming once he realized the kind of trouble he was in. Delaney continued. Seems Crane has a whole network of informants in county offices, title companies, even the state environmental agency. Somehow, he got wind of the aquifer surveys filed back in the 60s. But those should have been confidential, Grace protested, setting a plate of steaming omelets on the table. Should have been, Delaney agreed grimly. But money has a way of making confidential things suddenly accessible. What happens now? Jackson asked, the businessman in him already calculating next moves, potential legal challenges, and protective measures. Sheriff Delaney's expression hardened. Now we build a case against Crane. Breaking and entering, conspiracy, attempted theft, criminal trespass, assault. The list goes on. Reed turned state's evidence in exchange for consideration during sentencing. So we've got testimonial evidence to go with your drone footage and physical evidence. From the living room, Logan's voice joined the conversation, startling everyone except Shadow, who had known the moment the teenager awoke. I've been thinking about something, he said, walking into the kitchen with his laptop. The drone caught audio of those guys talking about getting paid extra if they put pressure on you, Dad. I think they were supposed to scare you, maybe even hurt you, if you didn't cooperate. A tense silence followed this revelation. Shadow moved to Logan's side, pressing against his leg as if offering protection even from the memory of such a threat. Jackson's jaw tightened visibly. Delaney, I want full criminal charges pursued. No plea deals, no reduced sentences. These men came into our home, threatened my family, way ahead of you, the sheriff assured him. Judge Hartman issued search warrants for Crane's offices in Bozeman and his home in Big Sky at 5 a.m. this morning. State investigators are executing them as we speak. Grace reached for Jackson's hand across the table, her fingers intertwining with his. What about the aquifer? She asked softly. if this becomes public during the trial. Jackson was quiet for a long moment, the weight of his grandfather's trust heavy on his shoulders. Finally, he looked up, resolution clear in his expression. It's time to go public with it, on our terms. I'll contact the Montana Land Trust tomorrow. We can place the aquifer and the surrounding watershed under permanent conservation easement. That way, no matter what happens to the property in the future, the water remains protected. Bill Henson nodded his approval. Smart move, Jackson. Conservation easement means you still own the land, but specific uses, like water extraction for commercial purposes, are permanently restricted. Even if Crane somehow got his hands on the property decades from now, he couldn't touch the aquifer. The morning light now streamed fully through the kitchen windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the golden beams. Outside, Matty Henson was taking care of Shadow's morning needs, walking him around the property on a makeshift patrol that the dog clearly appreciated, his stride purposeful despite the lingering effects of the sedative. Sheriff Delaney finished his coffee and stood, settling his hat back on his head. The county prosecutor wants to meet with all of you today, if possible. The sooner we formalize statements, the better our case will be. As the sheriff prepared to leave, Logan suddenly spoke up again. Does this mean we're cutting our vacation short? Jackson looked at his son in surprise, then exchanged a glance with Grace. I thought after everything that happened, you'd be ready to head back to New York. Logan shook his head, a new determination visible in his posture. No way. Those guys try to scare us off, right? If we leave, they win. He reached down to pet Shadow, who had returned from his patrol with Maddie. Besides, I've got drone footage of the entire property to finish mapping, and Shadow needs time to recover. Grace smiled, a mix of pride and relief warming her expression. I think we can arrange to stay the full 3 weeks as planned. I'm not quite ready to give up these Montana mornings. As Sheriff Delaney drove away, the Whitmore family stood together on the porch, watching the Montana landscape come alive with morning light. The threat had been contained, the motive revealed, but something fundamental had changed at Willow Creek Ranch. What had begun as a simple summer getaway had transformed into a deeper connection to the land, to the community, and to each other. Shadow sat at attention beside them, his posture alert despite his ordeal. In protecting his family, he had not only foiled a criminal scheme, but had also preserved a legacy that stretched back generations. The hidden water beneath Willow Creek Ranch would remain safe, flowing unseen beneath the Montana soil, protected by laws, conservation easements, and the enduring vigilance of a remarkable German shepherd. The revelation of motive had brought clarity, but it had also cemented the Whitmore's resolve. This land was worth protecting, worth fighting for, a truth that Shadow had understood instinctively all along. The August sun blazed overhead as the annual Gallatin County Fair reached its final day. Crowds meandered between carnival rides and agricultural exhibits, the air rich with the scent of funnel cakes, grilled corn, and livestock. The grandstand buzzed with anticipation, rows of folding chairs filled with local ranchers, townspeople, and summer visitors alike, all gathered for what the fair program listed simply as Special Recognition Ceremony. At the center of it all sat the Whitmore family. Jackson in a crisp button-down shirt and jeans that had gradually replaced his New York business attire over the past 6 weeks, Grace beside him in a sundress with a denim jacket, and Logan, who had grown noticeably taller and more confident since their arrival in Montana. But it was the fourth member of their group who drew the most attention. Shadow, the German shepherd, sat at perfect attention, his coat gleaming in the sunlight, a specially made bandana bearing the Gallatin County Sheriff's emblem tied around his neck. I still think this is excessive, Jackson murmured to Grace as the county commissioner approached the microphone. Grace squeezed his hand. Let them have this, Jackson. It's not just about Shadow. It's about the community coming together. They need their heroes and their celebrations. In the 6 weeks since the attempted break-in at Willow Creek Ranch, the story had spread throughout the county, growing more elaborate with each telling. What began as a straightforward criminal case had transformed into a modern frontier legend. The tale of a retired military dog who single-handedly thwarted corporate raiders attempting to steal Montana's precious water resources. The truth, which included the crucial roles played by the ranch's security system, Grace's quick thinking, Logan's drone footage, and the rancher response network, often got streamlined in the retelling. In the simplified version that had captured local imagination, Shadow had become something more than a dog. He was a symbol of resistance against outside forces threatening the Montana way of life. County Commissioner Martha Layton tapped the microphone, her voice projecting across the grandstand. "Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this special recognition ceremony. Today, we honor not just extraordinary bravery, but the spirit of community that defines Gallatin County." Shadow's ears perked forward at the sound, but he remained perfectly still, years of military training evident in his disciplined posture. 6 weeks ago, Commissioner Layton continued, an attempted robbery at Willow Creek Ranch was thwarted thanks to the extraordinary actions of a remarkable dog and the rapid response of neighboring ranchers. What we didn't know then, what has only recently come to light through the ongoing criminal investigation, is that this was not a simple burglary. It was part of a coordinated attempt by corporate interests to gain control of one of our most precious resources, water. A murmur ran through the crowd. The case against Victor Crane and Watershed Holdings had made headlines across the state, with new revelations emerging weekly about the company's tactics in acquiring water rights throughout the drought-stricken West. The quick actions of one family and their remarkable dog not only prevented a crime, but also exposed a conspiracy that threatened ranches throughout our valley, Layton said, her voice solemn. And today, we're gathered to recognize that bravery. Logan leaned toward Shadow, whispering in the dog's ear, "You're famous, boy. Wait till your old military buddies hear about this." Shadow's tail thumped once against the wooden platform, his eyes remaining fixed forward as if standing at attention for inspection. Commissioner Layton gestured toward the Whitmore family. "Jackson Whitmore, would you and Shadow please step forward?" Jackson rose, feeling slightly self-conscious as he walked to the podium, with Shadow moving precisely at his heel. The German Shepherd's gait showed no sign of his ordeal weeks earlier. Dr. Rodriguez's care had ensured a complete recovery. "Mr. Whitmore," Commissioner Layton said, handing him a framed certificate. "On behalf of Gallatin County, we present this official commendation to Shadow for exceptional service to our community." The crowd erupted in applause. Shadow, seemingly aware of the significance of the moment, sat at perfect attention, his amber eyes scanning the crowd as if still on duty. "Would you like to say a few words?" the commissioner asked, offering Jackson the microphone. Jackson hesitated, then nodded, taking the microphone with one hand while the other rested on Shadow's head. Public speaking had never made him nervous. He'd addressed boards of directors and shareholders for decades. But this felt different, more personal. "Thank you," he began, his voice steady. "When my grandfather left me Willow Creek Ranch, he included a letter explaining why this land was special, not just because of what lies beneath it, though by now most of you know about the aquifer, but because of the community that surrounds it." Shadow remained motionless beside him, a steady presence against the backdrop of hundreds of watching eyes. "My family and I came to Montana seeking a quiet vacation," Jackson continued. "What we found instead was a reminder of what matters most." Shadow here, he ruffled the dog's fur affectionately, did what he was trained to do. He protected his family. But so did all of you, responding to our emergency within minutes, creating a network of support stronger than any security system money could buy. The neighboring ranchers scattered throughout the crowd nodded in recognition, many of them wearing small smiles of satisfaction. "So while I appreciate this recognition for Shadow, I'd like to extend it to all of you. In New York, I have business associates. Here in Montana, I've found neighbors in the truest sense of the word." The applause that followed was genuine and warm. As Jackson returned to his seat, Logan noticed tears in his father's eyes, something he'd never seen before. Commissioner Layton returned to the microphone. "And now, Mr. Whitmore has an announcement regarding Willow Creek Ranch that I believe will interest everyone here." Jackson stood again, this time bringing Grace and Logan with him. Shadow followed, positioning himself in front of the family in a subtly protective stance. "As many of you know, the water beneath Willow Creek Ranch is a significant resource," Jackson began. "My grandfather discovered it decades ago, but chose to keep it protected rather than exploited. Following the recent events, my family and I have made a decision we'd like to share with you today." The crowd fell silent, attentive. Water rights were no small matter in Montana, especially with droughts becoming more frequent and severe. "We've established the Willow Creek Watershed Trust, partnering with the Montana Land Conservancy to place the entire aquifer and surrounding watershed under permanent protection, Jackson announced. Additionally, we're launching a program to train service dogs specifically for rural defense and companionship, inspired by Shadow's extraordinary abilities. The announcement drew a standing ovation. In the front row, Bill and Maddie Henson exchanged approving looks, while Sheriff Delaney nodded his satisfaction. The protection of the aquifer had been a point of concern throughout the community since the details of Crane's scheme had become public. The first class of dogs will begin training next spring, Jackson continued once the applause had subsided. The program will be funded entirely by my family, but will prioritize placement with rural families, particularly those in areas with limited emergency response resources. As the ceremony concluded and people began to disperse toward the carnival midway, a group of children cautiously approached Shadow, clearly drawn to the canine hero but uncertain how to interact with such a distinguished animal. "Is it okay if they pet him?" a mother asked Grace, holding back an eager 6-year-old. Grace looked to Jackson, who nodded. "Shadow, visitors," he said clearly, using the command that released the dog from his formal duty stance into a more relaxed, approachable mode. Shadow's posture immediately softened, his tail wagging gently as the children approached one by one, offering their small hands for him to sniff before carefully petting his gleaming coat. "He's so soft," one little girl exclaimed in surprise. "I thought he'd be tough like a police car." Logan laughed. "He can be both. That's what makes him special." As the afternoon progressed, the Whitmore family made their way through the fair, Shadow trotting beside them, occasionally stopping for people who recognized him from the news coverage and asked to take photos. The German Shepherd handled his celebrity with the same stoic dignity he brought to everything, accepting the attention as simply another duty to perform. Near the 4-H exhibits, they encountered Dr. Rodriguez, who greeted Shadow with professional affection, checking his shoulder where the tranquilizer dart had grazed him. "Our local celebrity looks fantastic," she said, straightening up from her examination. "You'd never know he took down an armed intruder 6 weeks ago. We owe you a debt of gratitude, Doctor," Jackson said warmly. "Your quick response that night made all the difference." Dr. Rodriguez smiled, patting Shadow's flank. "I should be thanking you. Since Shadow's story went public, my practice has been flooded with calls from ranchers wanting to invest in trained protection dogs. It's a wise decision, especially for the more remote properties." As the sun began to set over the fairgrounds, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, the Whitmore family found themselves on a hilltop overlooking the valley. Shadow sat beside them, his silhouette regal against the fading light. "Hard to believe we're heading back to New York next week," Grace said softly, leaning against Jackson's shoulder. "This place feels like home now." Logan, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke up. "Do we have to go back? I mean, permanently?" Jackson turned to his son in surprise. "What about school? Your friends? The debate team you worked so hard to join?" Logan shrugged, his eyes on Shadow. "I can do online school. And after everything that happened, I don't know. New York just seems so small now. So artificial." He gestured to the vastness of the Montana landscape spread before them. "This feels real." Jackson and Grace exchanged a long look, a silent conversation passing between them, the kind that only happens after decades together. "I've been thinking the same thing," Jackson admitted finally. "My company has been virtual since the pandemic anyway, and watching the trial against Crane unfold, I want to be here for that. I want to see it through." "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" Grace asked, hope coloring her voice. Jackson took a deep breath, the weight of a significant decision settling on him. Yet somehow, it felt lighter than he expected. "I'm saying maybe it's time Willow Creek Ranch had permanent residents again. Maybe my grandfather always knew that someday I'd come back for good." Shadow, as if sensing the importance of the moment, rose and moved to stand in front of the family, facing outward toward the valley. His valley now, continuing his endless watch, the guardian of Willow Creek Ranch whose legend would be told in Gallatin County for generations to come. From military working dog to family pet to local hero, Shadow's journey had come full circle. And as the stars began to appear in the vast Montana sky, the German Shepherd stood vigilant, his silhouette a comforting presence against the gathering darkness, a legendary guardian who had found his true home. "Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and if you watched until here, comment, "I watched until here," and leave your opinion about this story. Oh, and don't forget to watch the next video that appears on the end screen. It's very exciting.